should be able to join us now. So my name is Benny. I'm here with Volare, formerly known as NVRDC. And then, there's Jenny. Hey, Jenny.
Hey,
Hey, awesome. I was just telling folks we were waiting for you. Now you're here. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. How are you doing?
Good. The sunshine kind of helps compared to yesterday or some parts of the week, right?
Oh yeah, I'm hoping that it just continues to get warmer, less wind, and
For
just
sure.
more sun.
Yes, for sure. Awesome. Well, let's start first by introducing ourselves. So I'm happy to kick us off. I've done maybe one or two lives before, but for folks joining us, my name is Benny. I'm the engagement manager at Volare, formerly known as Network for Victim Recovery of DC or NVRDC. Essentially, I do a lot of this. So I do a lot of outreach, presentations, really trying to engage with the community because we feel like the more community is involved, we really truly can work on hopefully one day ending any sort of violence. So, and I say that because Volare provides free and trauma-informed advocacy, legal, and therapeutic services to all survivors of crime. And when I say any type of crime, it's any type of crime. We do co-run the sexual assault crisis response program in the district. So yes, definitely sexual assault, but also domestic violence, stalking, gun violence. We work with surviving members of homicide, hate crimes, etc. So that's really awesome for us. And Jenny, tell us about First Shift Justice Project.
Yeah. Well, once again, hello, folks. I am the DC Outreach Coordinator at First Shift, and what that means is I similarly do a lot of community outreach, which can mean going out and doing Know Your Rights presentations, talking about what FMLA, DC Paid Family Leave is, as well as what workplace rights folks have who specifically are working parents, caregivers, or pregnant people. And I just go out to community events as well to pass out information. And so, kind of already added in what specifically we do, but we are a legal nonprofit, and our services are free for the DMV. And once again, our focus is primarily on supporting people in the workplace who are pregnant, parents, or caregivers. So, when we talk about caregivers, for example, you're taking care of a family member who might have a chronic illness. With pregnancy, it can be both during pregnancy and postpartum that we support people if they are experiencing discrimination, if they need to take time off for medical reasons, they need pregnancy accommodations, and there's intersections with this and supporting folks who've experienced crimes like domestic violence that we can get into in a second.
Yeah, well, actually, when I do these lives, like when we've done them with other organizations, I like to start there because some people are sometimes surprised why, like, Volare is having these conversations with folks. Like, how does it all kind of connect? So let's kind of break it down. So I just explained, right? Like, we work with survivors of crime, so people who've experienced harm, experienced trauma. So how does that intersect with you all? Like, what is the connection there in the work you all do regarding workers' rights?
Yeah, the way that it most directly intersects is, and I'll be talking a bit about, rights that people have, is that people who are dealing with, for example, a domestic violence situation or sexual abuse, can use time off
Mm.
to address those things, whether it's going to court or if you're dealing with medical issues because of domestic violence that you've experienced. Once again, you can use things like FMLA or DC paid family leave to take time off. So it's one of those things that people might not always be aware about. But that's, certainly a way that we, try to teach people what exists and things that are, resources for them as they, navigate, traumatic experiences.
Well, so you said a lot of acronyms that I think you may know what they mean, and I mean, maybe everyone's supposed to know what they mean. Do you want to explain what those rights that workers have, like FMLA and all of that stuff?
Yeah. Yeah, I can definitely go into it. So there's a few different things. So The first I'll explain is the DC Paid Sick and Safe Leave Act. Usually people just say DC Paid Sick Leave, but in DC they did add safe to acknowledge that that time off can be used not just to, take your child to a doctor's appointment or take yourself to a doctor's appointment, but it can be used for things like attending court, or to manage a domestic violence situation. So with DC Paid Sick and Safe Leave, this is, depending on where you're working and how much time you've accrued, it can be 3 to 7 days of job protected leave. And this is, once again, paid. So if you need to take more than, let's say, 3 consecutive days, you might have to provide documentation, but if it's less than 3 days, you're not legally required. And that's something that comes up even outside of, situations where people are taking that time off because of domestic violence. Even just people who are sick and need to, take a day off, right? Sometimes the employers are asking them for documentation, and they absolutely don't need to provide that if it's less than 3 days. And then the other acronyms I am happy to explain. So FMLA, or the Family Medical Leave Act.
Yeah.
This is, some folks can be familiar with, like in the workplace. There's both the federal version and then the DC version. But both of them, their purpose is so that folks have access to job protected time off that is unpaid, so that you can recover from, a serious illness or to care for another family member. And once again, this you could use, for example, if you have a physical or even mental health condition that has arisen from domestic violence. And then lastly, DC Paid Family Leave, or DCPFL, which you can use while you are on job protected leave, and it provides paid benefits. So a lot of times people use both because, we certainly live in a time where, like, economically it's very hard to just take time off without being paid. So we always like to, explain both of them, because if you're taking the time off already, you should definitely look into getting paid benefits.
Yeah. And I know you're mentioning domestic violence a lot. And I think for some folks, there's like immediate thoughts of, oh, these workers' rights and people's rights typically go with physical health. So I think we want to kind of right? It's like a yes and. Yes, that's very true. If you're like a caretaker to someone who has like some physical health barriers, or you yourself are focusing on your physical health. But I think a lot of people forget about mental health, which can look all sorts of ways. But something that we think about at Volaris a lot is working with folks who've experienced harm and trauma and crime, is that also impacts your mental health, your well-being. It could be physical for sure, or even grief, right? Like where you need some time to take on, and also just the impact of trauma, which I don't believe our society is set up to support people in that way. So it's almost like you have to see what the system has, like these rights, to kind of hopefully support your healing in the best way. And I think I was telling you about this story, and like my first role at Volare was responding to the hospital to sexual assault survivors to provide support if they kind of needed that. And I was telling you about, we get through this medical forensic exam, which takes anywhere from like 2 to 6 hours, truly based on what someone decides to do and engage in. And one of the questions advocates ask, towards the end is, hey, do you think you're going to need a note to either your school or your employer? And in this case, it was someone's employer. So there goes the rights. And so, my job as an advocate was to advocate with the doctor. And most of the time it's not even advocating, it's asking like, hey, just a heads up, they are wanting that doctor's note essentially to provide to their employer. Because for some folks, like, it's funny hearing you say like, you actually don't need a letter if it's like less than 3 days. And some folks still feel like, I don't feel maybe safe enough to do that. Like, I want to make sure they know like this is a legit thing, right? And this doctor looked me straight in the eye and they're like, well, the forensic nurse said there were no physical injuries, so I'm not providing a note. And this was bananas to me on many levels. One, because similar to this, people stay truly in the physical injury, physical capacity purely. So we did some psycho ed and we're like, hey, like, this is the impact of sexual assault, of trauma. It's not purely physical, right? And we did get that note. Everyone, you can relax. We did get that note. But it just, like, when I was telling you the story before, it brought up like just that like frustration of how if people don't know like their rights, like, and I'm not saying, oh my god, I came and saved the day, but if a person didn't have an advocate or someone like from First Justice Project being like, these are your rights, this is what should be happening, like so many missed opportunities, so many what I would believe is violation of rights just based on ignorance, I would say, to some degree, right?
Right. Yeah. That's thank you for sharing that story. Because I think once again, even within our scope beyond just, this like more specific clientele, just generally, we always try to remind people when we're out doing, presentations and just general
Mm-hmm.
outreach about, you know, yeah, a lot of times when we talk about taking time off for medical needs, we automatically just think of like injury,
Mm-hmm.
illness that is like much more visible and not necessarily about mental health. And so definitely, I advocate and encourage people to think about what, using things like FMLA for mental health, which does fall under like the conditions that it will cover. So um, certainly people should be aware of that. But to your point about having an advocate or having people there who understand what their rights are, it is really difficult. And I see it, all the time with just generally workplace
Yeah.
rights, people being very nervous to um, really assert, like, even if they know things, to assert
Mm.
what they know, because, there's also the mental load of going back and forth with an employer about needing time off or
Yeah.
needing accommodations. Like, even that is very taxing on people. And, sometimes it makes folks just want to leave their workplace because they don't find it
Mm.
worth, the back and forth of having to like argue or advocate
Mhm.
for themselves. So I think that is where orgs like ours can be very beneficial in terms of supporting people through the
Yeah.
process of here's the information, but
Yeah.
also, for example, like our legal team, they don't just provide consultation to people, but they will get involved in a case if one, the client wants that and has agreed to it, and two, there is a path forward. So,
Mm.
um, I totally get the, like, you on your own, it can be very scary, but definitely that's what I know we're here for,
Yeah.
and really want people to
Right.
like reach out to us to provide that
Yeah.
information.
But Jenna, you just said something that was a humbling reminder to myself. Like when you were saying, like, some people know their rights, but it's like still a hesitancy to invoke those rights or even mention it to their employer. And I feel like that brought up for me two things. One, not everyone wants to tell their employer even that something's going on, right? And typically those letters don't say, like, for example, in the case I use, that letter wasn't going to say, this person showed up to get experience a sexual assault and then they got a medical forensic exam. Like, it wasn't going to say that detail. It was going to be general. We ensure that it's super general, like, hey, this person is not able to go back to work until X date, right? However, even then, to your point, some people don't want any of that. So that's one level of they may not even want to invoke those rights. And what you said is super interesting. I'd love for you to go further into it. Some folks almost feel like, I don't even want to not have a fight, but I don't even want to go back and forth or like have to feel like I'm fighting for something. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah, I'm happy to go into it. In our work, I feel, um, yeah, I think there's the piece of like education. So wanting to like, if you don't feel secure in like what you're
Yeah.
arguing for, right? That's one piece. But also, um, in the past, I've done, quite a few presentations a lot with folks who are restaurant workers or work in the service industry, people who might be undocumented, for example. And
Mm-hmm.
so, that's
Yes.
like a whole
Whole
other layer, of
other thing.
course.
Yep.
And so there's that fear of, if I say something and they maybe have already experienced it actually, of like speaking up,
Retaliation.
yeah, retaliation in the workplace and already having experienced that discrimination or being fired from a job, or being threatened with being
Mm-hmm.
fired. So I think that's also part of where people, either previous experience, maybe they've seen it happen to a friend, and then they just don't want to say anything, which is very, very understandable. And I think why, like, I know for me, like, the part of my job I enjoy the most is going out and doing those Know Your Rights
Mm-hmm.
presentations, so I can talk to people more directly and say, hey, these are your rights, and here are maybe best ways for you to advocate for yourself, but also that, like, we exist, to support you in that process, so you're not just going through it alone. But it's just something that I definitely, keep in mind, and especially like in this current era, just thinking about like the fear that people
Yeah.
might be experiencing, and how to like honor
Yeah.
that as well.
Yep. And no, those are helpful reminders, even for us who, like, I think sometimes when we do certain work, we're like, oh, yeah, like, I know that I've had cases, but it's always a humbling reminder to your point of people have different experiences, different dynamics, and they know their life best. And so, as much as we're like, you have these rights, you can do it, right? There's also a reminder like they know their life best, they know their boss best compared to us, at least, right? And people are always going to do what feels best for them in that moment, what feels safest in that moment, no matter whether we're like, ugh, why, or I might want to do something different if it was my life, or etc. And that reminds me of this tenet that at Volare we use, which I feel like we're well aligned in, like survivor defined justice. Only folks can tell us what they want and need, and hopefully we can support them along the way. But only folks can decide whether that's to, nope, I don't want to tell my employer a thing, or yes to all, please, I'm gonna invoke all of these. So that's a helpful reminder for us all.
Yeah.
And Jenny, as you were talking, I feel like, okay, we've talked about this physical health, mental health, impact of trauma, and then something that also comes up for us, I'm not sure if you all see it too, is when we are working with survivors, and let's say they do, for example, decide to pursue reporting, there's court hearings, right? Even if it's not reporting and someone's trying to get a civil protection order, or most people know it, a restraining order, there's court hearings, there's dates, you have to go places, you have to miss work because when's the court open? 9 to 5-ish type hours. So do you also see that?
Yeah, actually, and that segues perfectly into the story that I had for to
Mm,
share about a client, which
yeah.
is somebody that was referred to us, and she was dealing with um, yeah, a restraining order situation, and at her work she had taken time off
Yeah.
to deal with more of the court appearances and like legal things, like getting prepared, and also she had like an agreement with her job to um, come into work a little later, like 30
Okay.
minutes later, just
Nice.
to like so
Yeah.
she'd have the chance to, drop off her children at
Mm.
school. And then basically they told her she would have to use like unpaid leave
Mm.
to take the time off moving forward, because she didn't have any more remaining paid leave. And within that same day of being told this, she was just straight up terminated for
The same
having,
day. So they
yeah,
told her, hey, you can't do this. And JK, actually doesn't matter. You're
yeah,
fired.
yeah. Um, Even though for basically, I think having too many tardies or being late too often, despite them
Right.
having, a little bit of an
Yeah.
agreement of why she was coming in.
Yeah.
So her job was aware of what was going on. And so I think with that situation, it's, yeah, of course, like, once again, we've talked, like you said, about the physical aspects, but also like just the like having to go to court is a whole thing. You
Mm-hmm.
need to take time off. So reiterating that, yeah, paid sick leave is there for those situations, but also in this instance, like, what stood out to me was just definitely her workplace, maybe not being supportive and sort of just like turning their back on her. And I'm sure that was very frustrating in this situation. But yeah, and I think the situation just also reminds me of like the ways that as you're going through this
Mhm.
process, there's already the trauma from what you've experienced, but then the continued trauma of
Yes.
like
Yes.
having to relive and explain, and then your workplace just, yeah, not being as
Uh,
supportive. So,
uh, yes, but that's exactly it, right? Like,
yeah,
because like, and I'm such like a research, and I hate to be that person, but there is research that says like for a lot of people, yes, the event is traumatic, but a lot of survivors have said, yeah, the event sucked. It was awful, one of the worst things. And how people responded was even worse. Like, right? Like all these hoops you have to jump through. And typically, yes, right? Like we know it could be systems like the court, like the criminal legal system, it could be the hospital, the ambulance driver, like whoever. But it's also your workplace because I mean, let's just name a thing. We live in a capitalist society, so people need money, so they need to go to work, right? And one of the worst parts of when this happens is the world doesn't stop. And I say that so sadly because it's bananas to ask someone to be like, yeah, this one of the worst experiences of your life just happened, and the world has kept going. You still have to go to work. You still are a parent, are caregiver, etc. Like that sometimes can feel so overwhelming. And to your point, like something that was right on the money for me is when a workplace is not supportive, that can be re-traumatizing. That can exacerbate the very things that they're like, hey, for example, I need time off to decompress, maybe just take a breather. And ironically, like the more hoops you give this person, that's not right. Like, how are they going to be, quote, productive? How are they going to be helpful in whatever your goal, your mission is in whatever job, right? Whether that's customer service, like provide, who knows, right? So to me, it's so counterintuitive if like, do you know what I mean? Like even as business mind, which I don't have a business mind, but even if like I pretend I do, it still doesn't make sense to me. Like I would want folks, in my business, in my organization to be present and able to do XYZ
yeah,
versus them not feeling like they can.
right. And also, like, uh, the DC Human Rights Act does include accommodations for people who are experiencing domestic violence. And one of those things is like schedule modifications
Yeah. Mhm.
and like transfers and reassignment. So, there's definitely, rights in that sense of, in the workplace that they can make these types of accommodations, but it's just a matter of if they choose to uphold them or not. And that is really frustrating. Like you said, we live in the capitalistic world. So, of course, like the world just keeps on
Mm,
turning. And so,
yeah.
just thinking of like, yeah, how that is just like another added layer of stress for people to deal with as they figure out court and their own safety. So, yeah,
Well, even just as you say the word safety, which is to me a basic human need. Like, if we're imagining Maslow's hierarchy, which is like a pyramid, right? Like, at the very base, it's like safety, food. What? Like, it's truly like without that, how are we expecting people to function, right? Whether that is like sexual violence, domestic violence, especially if it's like an active, right, where they may still be in that relationship, that experience, like it's sometimes weird because I've been doing this work for a while. Like for example, right out of college, I worked at a domestic violence safe house, and then I moved to DC to work at Volare. So I've worked with survivors for many, many years. I'm probably aging myself. And it's still always shocking to me the unrealistic expectations society has, and that includes workplaces of snap out of it. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
It almost feels like they just expect people to continue on as if nothing has happened.
right,
And,
right,
you know, one, it's like we have these legal requirements. For example, like when you said that person was fired after they had said, yes, feel free if you need to take 30 extra minutes in the morning to make sure your children are okay. Um, like I can imagine that I would say trauma of that,
right,
of being
right,
fired after experiencing, I'm not sure what the experience, but some harm, some trauma
right,
already.
right.
Um, because I'm, what was there any resolution in that case?
Oh yeah. So the resolution was, she obviously was referred to us, so our legal team was able to support her, and they were able to negotiate a settlement with her employer. So, definitely was good to get some recourse out of that.
So they had to
Um,
pay.
yeah, yeah, they did. And so, we have to celebrate the wins as well, and that's from what I know, like even other cases, that's unfortunately, while the money is like, of course, beneficial and, in my mind, the least that they could do to support
Mm-hmm.
people. But yeah, I think, having that kind of win is just a reminder of where the advocacy and having these like connections can be very helpful of, imagine you as just one person trying to figure out
Yeah.
how you would even try to um, yeah, push back on your employer. So yeah,
I mean, talk about power dynamics, right?
yeah,
Like, I mean, to your
exactly.
point, like, which is, I always bring up power dynamics because that's what we consider the root causes, excuse me, of trauma, of violence. And so the power dynamics itself that are potentially replaying for someone, depending on what that experience was of, now I have to engage with you and you have the power to fire me. So I want to be really careful about what I say and do. It's just, yeah, I can't imagine.
Yeah,
But I'm glad it, again, somewhat, there was some type of resolution. I know often people would just wish it hadn't even happened, and that's hard to give back. Like we can't go back in time.
right.
But um, I love this. I'm sure we could continue on and on. But I'm wondering, do you see, like, yeah, what would you ask from community members? Like, what could we do to kind of help and support people in those situations?
Yeah, there's a few things. One thing I wanted to add to this was, advice kind of for other
Yeah,
orgs, for
yeah.
example, is just like, talking about employment with clients. I know that our folks who do intake, do a lot of screening of just like other things, not just for what we support people with, but for trafficking, for example, and then kind of referring people out. So I think, you don't have to be an employment expert. You don't need
Mm-hmm.
to know like all the laws, but
Mm-hmm.
just like talking to people about what they might be experiencing in the workplace, and sharing out this information now that you know it about what accommodations they might have, what job protected leave is, and what TC paid family leave is. And just understanding that, unfortunately, just like many other like legal processes, that there, is a lot of documentation that might need to happen at different points. And so being aware of, how taxing that might be, but ultimately, yeah, just talking to people about what they might be experiencing. And, you know, we are here as a resource.
Yes.
But the other piece would just be, yeah, you can reach out to us. And if you work for an org or maybe you're part of a parent group, whatever it may be, we do know your rights presentations, like I said at the beginning. And really, I deeply believe in like, community education as a great tool for like disseminating information, and um, I one thing that was coming to my mind with a lot of what we were discussing is
Yeah.
just building trust, with like helping folks who are survivors of crime. Like, you have to have a deep level of trust. And similarly for us with, supporting people through a legal process, like there has to be trust. So, um, once again, I think that like being out there, like being face to face is a great way to do that. And then we do have a volunteer network
Oh,
that we've started. So you can go to our website and learn more about it there.
amazing. I loved a lot of what you were saying is I think things people overlook often, which is like, hey, have conversations, right? And it's something that quote can seem simple, but I always say it takes a community and not everyone has to be an advocate, has to be an attorney, has to be like know all of the all of the rights everyone has, no matter their like their workplace or, etc. And I like that because that's actually what I would say too is like knowledge is power. The more we can spread the info, even if the info is like, hey, these folks can do a know your rights presentation. I don't know all of them, but these folks can tell you. Like all of that, spreading information, sharing resources is so, so powerful. And for us, like I would actually say the same. Connect people with resources. Like even when we table and do outreach, I'm like, please take our information. This doesn't mean you're going to need it. You might not, but your neighbor might need it. Your friend, your roommate, like whoever. It's always thinking about like, how can I be a support to my community? Um, and they may never tell us what's going on, and that's okay. But if we're able to offer that, well, you don't have to tell me, and maybe you want to share it with other folks who can support you. So I think there's power in that, especially now because I'm thinking April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. So for us, we're already gearing up to really that focus. And for any type of trauma and harm, I think this way that this rings true for April as well, and sexual assault awareness of like we can end it. Like things don't have to be this way. We can do better, all of us as a community, to support one another and act. So I think perfect way to kind of end. So check First Shift Justice Project out, follow them. And of course, Volare is also on Instagram. Reach out if you, yeah, like you said, check out our websites. If you want to share our numbers, all of that good stuff. And hopefully we're building stronger communities together.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for hosting
Thanks,
this.
Jenny. Of course. Good combo. And thanks, everyone. And of course, it's going to stay on our grid, so you can go back to it or share it with some folks that
Yes.
maybe they'll find it helpful. All right. Bye.
Bye.